Good evening and welcome to another fascinating episode of the Chocolate Box Presents. I'm your host, Chocolate Drop. As usual, you're in for a fascinating program. Today we're going to talk about something that can be I'm trying to play on the words board games and being bored about games and gaming. My guest is, you kind of like what I do with it, right?
Yeah.
My guest is Lee Gaddies. Lee is a phenomenal individual. He kind of was schooling me on Dungeons and Dragons, which I only heard of but know nothing about. And it got me to think about games that employ strategy and intellect, and that was a spinoff into Monopoly and chess. So, Lee Gaddies, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, Dungeons and Dragons. Tell us what Dungeons and Dragons is, because it's been around for a while.
So we're talking about the topic of gaming, chess, which is a variation of a game that was invented in Egypt, is a strategy game where you're trying to take over the board, control of the board, using certain pieces that do certain maneuvers. Monopoly is a game that is a board game that teaches you finance. So, you save your money, you buy real estate, so on and so on and so forth. And Dungeons and Dragons is a role-playing game, and it's a game where you step outside your conventional world and you're able to play another type of person or another type of character. So, and what type of character you play can be randomly determined, or you can have something in mind that you want to play in the setting that you and the GM, the
GM
game,
is for?
Game master.
Game master,
that you and the game master create. So Dungeons and Dragons in particularly takes place in a medieval fantasy universe.
Okay.
So you would be playing any character from like Lord of the Rings, if people were familiar with that IP, or you would be playing, knights and wizards and elves and all the Western European fantasy lore set from medieval times. So that would be a role-playing game.
Okay.
And then you would have war games, which are most of the time set in historical settings, and it's a whole hobby incorporating miniatures. So the history of it is, with the older games like chess, each piece represents a unit in battle, and in the modern war games you would have tanks and infantry and artillery and air support and all that, and that would be representing that. But it's all based on that chess model, only it's a lot more complicated as our battlefields have become more complicated.
So it's interesting that we have them set up this way from a chronological standpoint in terms of the oldest, I guess, and so what?
To the most recent.
To the most recent. And so when was, I think this was like 1930s, I think it was kind of spin off from the Depression era.
It was from the Depression,
Depression era. And this is, like you said, goes way back. This is the oldest, started in Africa, right?
It was started in Egypt, and it probably might even be older than that. But so this is chess is a modern take on that older Egyptian game, which is about area of control.
Okay, and so now when did Dungeons and Dragons, who created it? And
So Gary Gygax created Dungeons and Dragons as we know it today. So this is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. This is one of the original Advanced Dungeons and Dragons books, and this tells the game master like how to determine the parameters.
Show the font, just turn around. So that's a small print. And this is one of several books.
Oh yeah.
And so you know all of this stuff.
Yeah. I grew up. This is what I grew up with. So you had tables to determine, different characteristics inside the game. So when you were playing, if your players did something and you didn't know how to that was unplanned for, which happens a lot in role-playing games, you could roll on a table and determine what the outcomes were.
See, I want you to bring, and I know you're traveling, but the board, because the pieces, this is a real intense gaming.
Yeah. Well, if you think about the whole hobby, so you pick a genre. Like even in board games, there's miniatures like you have with chess pieces, and part of the hobby is collecting miniatures and then painting them and then
which is what you do.
Which is what I do, yeah. Which is and make a lot of money at it, but and then using them to play out whatever scenario is there. So with role-playing games, one of the most interesting things, not just how it was intended to be played, but the permutations of it that have happened since it came out. So one of the ways, in 1996, I wrote a program for Mr. Walls at the Wayne County prison system.
Now we're talking Wayne County, Detroit,
Yeah,
Michigan.
Wayne County, Michigan.
Okay.
It's the county that Detroit sits in, and I wrote the program to use D&D as a tool to help returning citizens to deal with conflict and to de-escalate violence, so they could step outside of their traditional roles, right? Because if you try to do this out in the real world, somebody steps on your tennis shoes and they're white, conflict, right? But how do you deal with that without every decision you're making becoming a life or death situation with somebody that you're dealing with?
So that's why I want to do this program. And so some people may, first, well, why are you talking about games? This is so boring. Why are you talking about board games? This is boring. Right. Well, because of what you just said, there are real life applications for what you learn when you talk about finance and monopoly. And you look at it from a standpoint of the haves and the have-nots. The rich get richer, the poor gets poor.
Right.
Starting the game with zero, where you go around the board, and if you late getting in because of racial discrimination,
400 years behind.
400 years behind. But yet they want you just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps when you don't have any boots. So Monopoly can give you that lesson. When you talk about the game of chess, why is it that the white piece moved first? What's the history behind that?
Right. And so when you look at chess as a model, it also helps increase your analytical thinking.
Absolutely.
Right. So unlike video games where you're dealing with muscle reflex actions, right? When you're playing video games, with chess, you're trying to think ahead, you're trying to plan ahead. You can apply that same analytical thinking to your life.
Absolutely.
People that are living in desperate situations where they're short on money, where every altercation might end up, with deadly consequences, being able to play out those scenarios and to be able to rewire how your brain thinks and how you deal with people.
Your outcome can be different.
Your outcome can be completely different, and we've proven that. So by using games, we call it edutainment. It's entertainment through gaming.
Education.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can educate somebody through playing these games, right? So if I put something in a history book, maybe you only read it once. But if I put that same information in a game, you'll do it again and again and again, and it starts to sink in. And we learned that by doing that prison model. The only thing is they couldn't have dice in the prison. So
because why can't you have dice in the prison?
Gambling.
Oh.
Right.
Okay.
They would use it for.
But
gambling.
you got the state lottery. Right.
Right. Well, there's that.
Okay. But I digress.
Yeah. But so what the inmates did was that they used paper. They used origami and they made their dice out of paper. So it was really interesting. Yeah. People are really super creative when they want to get something. But what we learned from that is that by allowing people a safe space in which to role play the scenarios that they would face when they were coming back into society and how to deal with it, the success rates of them integrating back into society became much higher.
Because they had the skill set.
Because they had a brand new skill set.
Okay.
A skill set that if they went back to the environment that put them in prison,
they probably end up recidivism would come right back.
Yeah, it would never give them because you're back into the same situation that got you here, right? And so so being able to use these as tools to help to integrate people back into society was a very powerful one. And I know, and to the layman, I know that looking at it, they think, oh, you're not, what is it? It's just a game you're playing around. But no, you're actually learning real life skills. And we noticed that even over the last couple of years with COVID, when people are isolated and alone and not allowed to interact with other people,
they were forced to deal with board games and
and also your social skills degenerate, right? So when me and you sit down to play a game, we enter into a social contract, right? When we sit down at a chess game, we're going to play until we have a winner. We shake hands and we go our own way, right?
Right.
So with role-playing games, it's the same thing. You're able to step outside the construct that you've created of how you think you should interact with society or how society tells you should interact with other people, and you're able to take on another persona without fear, without threat, without any danger.
Yeah, it's not really life or death.
It's not life or death like it is out in real society.
But I want to kind of spin off the phrase life and death, because in this game you capture, instead of kill, you capture. Same what we said there, I take it, in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I mean, you have objectives set up by the dungeon master depending on what it is. I mean, any genre that you want to be in, you can role play it. So if you want to,
for example,
so this was honed on medieval fantasy because of the Lord of the Rings books written by Tolkien, and that was the parameters of that universe, right? So I've played games where I played myself, and my character was written up based on what. So I wrote up what I thought my attributes were, and then the group had to decide, are those the right attributes? Well, if I said I had 20/20 vision, that wasn't going to fly because I don't have 20/20 vision.
But how would the group know that?
They know me. So I had to play myself. I had to play myself in a situation, and then the game master threw in the scenario that it was a zombie apocalypse, and now we had to escape to get to wherever we needed to go in the real world, in modern day.
So how does one get to be a game master?
In modern day. You usually pick up a book.
Okay. Are you a game master? Are you a game master?
I've been game masters for many, many different game systems, right? You can do sci-fi. You can do ancient Egypt. I mean, any scenario that you're imagining. And what it also does, it sets your imagination free. Because if you wanted to create a world that was more reflective of you and how you saw the world, you can design that as a game master.
Can I design a world to eliminate racism and white supremacy?
You can. You can.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can play it. Here's the amazing thing. So when they created this world, there was no black people in this world.
I was going to get to that. You
Right.
know, how did you, being from Detroit, end up with Dungeons and Dragons?
Because I was just a kid that liked to read, and it was just another book.
Okay. Okay.
You know, so and for me to be able to create worlds that were more reflective of how I saw it and wanted it to be, and to be able to include myself in that world and other people of color in that world, right?
You had to create it.
Yeah, so you have to create it. So I set my adventures in Egypt and in the Congo, where you know it was where there was no colonizing going on, there was no colonialists going on. So we were able to delve deeply into an Afrocentric culture. And then when I got into high school, we did one before the term Afrofuturism were described, where it was black people in the future in a cyberpunk universe, right? So it was Detroit, but it was Detroit 2525.
Yeah, they've got an event Afrofuturism coming in Charlotte, I think, in August.
Yeah. So as it's gained, over the last 40 years, as it's gained more popularity, and the guy who wrote the cyberpunk role-playing game was a black game designer. So as we look at how we project ourselves and how we want to portray ourselves, instead of letting other people carve out what media we consume.
Come on.
Now we have the tools and technology we can carve out. We can create our own media and then broadcast that.
Yes. Power to define
who we are.
Yes, self-determination. I want to talk about Pokemon a little bit. I also want to talk about violence in video games.
Sure.
But I'm trying to weave that in with, you've got one that's talking about killing, capturing, but yet when you see about mass school shootings and all this stuff, make that all make sense to me. Connect that.
So how I see it, the social construct that we have is people not having an outlet or an expression, right? And so they internalize it and they let it out in a negative way. So what role-playing games allow you to do is to take whatever inner angst or frustration you're having and release it in a safe way, in a constructive way, right? So when we eliminate art, when we eliminate
music in the schools,
we eliminate creative outlets and positive outlets for those energies. If we only concentrate on putting a ball in a hoop or throwing a ball down a field,
you're not knocking that either, but still. Yeah.
But if that's all you have, there's people who don't have those abilities. Yeah, not everybody's going to be Spud Webb, So how do you allow those other people who aren't in that percentile to be able to express themselves and have it come out in a positive way instead of having it come out in a negative way? So if we talk about video games is a how do I want to say this? It's not a real interaction, right? Okay. You can't, if we sit down at a table and 8 of us are playing, you can't, rage quit because you're losing.
I don't know what rage quit means.
So in a video game, it's when I'm playing you, you're losing, and you just turn the game off.
Oh, kind of like turning your king down on the table.
Yeah.
It's like, I quit. Okay.
I quit, right?
Okay.
So you can do that with no consequences because you're just an anonymous, username on a board over the computer. And also, you isolate people, right? If you're at a computer, you're by yourself with your headphones on, and you're, just playing. You're isolated. And what gaming, either a chess model, a board game, or role-play game, allows you to interact with other people and allows you to build those bonds and see people as other human beings, so you're less likely to commit those type of acts. right? And it gets you out of that type of thinking, right? So again, this is a great way to rewire how young people think by putting them in situations where they can deal with their angst or their anger or their frustration and have a positive outcome from it.
Okay.
You know?
So let's make this personal a little bit, as much as you want to. So how?
By the way, Pokemon is a card game.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's another genre also.
Yeah. What I was wondering if that kind of if Dungeon D&D spawned Pokemon, just like D&D probably spawned the movies Lord of the Rings.
No, it would be like well, I think that the Pokemon and the bigger one of that in that card game genre, collectible card games, would be Magic the Gathering.
Never heard of it. Okay.
Right. So that is the biggest. It's owned
Wow.
by Hasbro. It's a huge.
What's the name of it again?
Hasbro. Oh, Magic the Gathering is the name of the card game. But if you go to any game store from Maine to California, you'll find card games, Magic the Gathering, you'll find Dungeons and Dragons, and you'll find another war game called Warhammer 40,000. Those are the bread and butter of any game store because they sell millions and millions. Matter of fact, Warhammer 40,000 is a $2 billion company that just sells little miniature guys.
It's a whole nother world.
Yeah, it's a whole nother world that we need to be a part
Yes.
of, right? I think that we need to be ubiquitous in every form and genre, that there is. There should never be a place where we are not there, where commerce is happening and taking place. So when I started my company, I think I'm probably the only black miniatures manufacturer making miniatures in the United States.
Wow.
And I'm one of many black game designers, but we're not as heralded as, I didn't.
Well, that's why we wanted you on this program, man.
Where, I didn't innovate the way that that Gary Gygax did, but then I don't have a 50-year history of doing it, right?
Or access to capital, maybe, too.
That is always a major issue, which brings us back to monopoly. Right. So,
to think about how do you get access to capital when strategizing with chess?
You got to have analytical thinking skills. You got to be able to plan ahead. You got to be able to think ahead. And so when we talk about how people interact with games and how they use games, if there's a skill you want to learn, there is a game that will help you. That will help you with that skill.
So, rapid fire. The Game of Thrones. Never watched it, but I know it was huge.
Yeah.
And again, kind of reason why I wanted to do this program is that one about why was there such fascination about Game of Thrones and also the whole Pokemon thing. Then the other part of that was dealing with. I was listening to NPR a while back, and they were talking about the lack of black people involved with D&D. Where they said, okay, well, I need to find somebody who's black, who's African American, who can help me to understand.
Right. Well,
what's the fascination with D&D?
It's not the lack of involvement with D&D. It's the lack of representation of black people who are playing D&D.
That's what they were
black
talking
people
about.
have been playing D&D since the beginning.
Yeah, but we don't see
black
that,
people have been involved, but when the media represents it, right, you don't see us. So, for example, I dedicated my second game, which was a World War II war game, Empire's Fall, to my grandfather, who was in the 761st Tank Battalion. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote a book called Brothers in Arms about his mailman who was a gunner in the 761st Tank Battalion. When he shopped that movie to Hollywood, by the time it went through all the different white hands that it went through, they attached Brad Pitt to it, and it became a movie called Fury.
Ooh.
Because they weren't going to make a movie about a black tank crew.
Makes you want to holler and throw it both your hands.
Right. So when we look at how we innovate and create, and then when it goes through the American media system, it gets whitewashed.
Yes, it gets whitewashed.
Literally gets whitewashed. So there's a lot of, and I grew up in the 80s, and I look at all the media that we were consuming. Black people were thugs, gangsters, drug dealers, or prostitutes. Right. Yeah. It's not until Eddie Murphy demanded, to do other things.
It wasn't Pluto Nash, was it?
No, it wasn't
Eddie Murphy.
No. It was 48 Hours.
Okay, with Nick Nolte.
With Nick Nolte. Right. And there was other movies where him and another comedian talk about the struggles that they had to go through. Like they had
Robert Townsend.
Right. And he talks
the Hollywood Shuffle.
Hollywood Shuffle, right? And there was a script that was written where the sidekick was a dog for the other guy, and he said, well, if you rewrite this, we could put a character in it, and he can do something else. And so they had to struggle to get these roles because they said, well, if we put black people as the main characters, nobody's going to go see the movie, right?
Yeah, I guess Black Panther proved that wrong, right?
And then they said so. And so literally an executive at Marvel said they will, like this was years ago before the Black Panther movie was greenlit, he said you'll never see a Black Panther movie because you can't have an African nation that's more technologically advanced than America on film, right? Because that was like the standard. And so it wasn't until the Black Panther movie, came out and made billions of
then you come
dollars
with Woman King,
with all
and you
black
come
cast.
with-
Yeah. Yeah, that said, well, now money can be made with all black cast and only one white actor, right? And usually those roles were reversed. So it's how America projects media across the world, how we create it and project it, and even with our social media, what are we consuming? What are they putting towards us to consume? And I think black people have been there in the beginning for all of this, but we just have to highlight them.
As we move towards the conclusion of our program, what are some other things, I know we touched upon briefly about the Afrofuturism. Can you
Sure.
elaborate on what that is? I know there's a gentleman by the name of Henry Rock with City Startup Labs. I think he's involved with this thing that's coming up. But what can you share with us about what you know about Afrofuturism?
Right. So if we wanted the history of it is Nichelle Nichols was on Star Trek as Lieutenant Uhura.
Okay.
Right. First black mainstream character on a sci-fi show. Before her, there had never been a black person in a mainstream sci-fi show. It was all been white people.
And we're talking about late 60s then, right? Late 60s?
1966.
Okay.
Right. So if you look at 1966, backwards, there had never been a black person shown in the future. Right, as being
Basically saying that we don't see you all in the future.
we don't see you all in the future, right? And she said that she wasn't getting enough airtime and the role wasn't meaty enough for her and she was going to leave the show. And Dr. Martin Luther King explained to her that realized we need you. We need to see you on set. Even if you don't get all the airtime and all the vocals and all that kind of stuff, we still need you because we need to see black people in the future.
Yes.
Right? And then she went on to become an ambassador for NASA, recruiting black astronauts into the aerospace program, into NASA. So it's important as we create content that we write about the future, that we see ourselves in the future, and we see ourselves in a positive light as being not just thugs and criminals, but also as creators and movers and shakers.
So what's your final takeaway from gaming and not being bored with board games, but strategizing, analyzing, thinking ahead, thinking the future? What are some of the takeaways you'd like to leave with our viewers?
Well, realize that role-playing games are not just D&D, board games are not just Monopoly, and strategy games aren't just chess. There's something out there for everybody. Not everything is for everybody, but you can find something that you and your family could like. Me and my family, we had a Thursday game night where we all just sat down at the table, bonded as a family, and we played games. And it was a great way to bring us together. And for the price of one game, like I go to a movie, I can spend 2 hours. I can buy a game, hundreds of hours of entertainment. Yeah.
And you're interacting with
when you're interacting with other people and you're building relationships and you're building those bonds. So find an area you like, go to your local game store and say, hey, I want a game that does this, or that's like this, or that has this type of theme on it.
Yeah, and we need more black people doing D&D.
And we need more black people writing D&D.
Right. And the words of the great band Parliament Funkadelic, thing. It ain't illegal yet, or whatever we go.
George Clinton.
Listen, my name is Chocolate Drop. I want to thank Mr. Lee Gaddies for taking time out of his obviously busy schedule to appear on tonight's episode of the Chocolate Box Presents. Normally, we like to have our guests participate in a little ritual we call the eating of the chocolate. I had to hook you up with some chocolate at a later date.
Okay.
But we want you, the viewer, to tune in each week, same day, same time, for another fascinating episode of the Chocolate Box Presents. And check us out on YouTube. We're going to have that in the lower thirds, however they do that. But we want you to go and check out some archived episodes of the Chocolate Box Presents. Lee is over here rubbing his hand. I think he has one more thing he wants to say, so I'm going to let you take it out.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you for having me. That's all. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you next week.
Violent task force, or zero tolerance task force is what they called it.
Because they call it the Scorpion.
They call that unit the Scorpion unit.
Okay.
So different agencies have different nicknames for it. Because
y'all know what they mean, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It stands out as like something to be
feared.
Yeah, feared and all that jazz, right? And usually these units consist of specialized officers who are trained to do certain tactics. Sometimes it requires that, sometimes not. It's just an officer who's really proactive and not afraid to mix it up in the community with people who are considered violent offenders. And so the Zero Tolerance Task Force that I was a member of was geared towards stopping gang violence before it happened. It was a summertime unit put together, assembled with several officers from the Street Drug and Addiction Unit, officers from the gang unit, and also school resource officers, because most of these kids that were involved in the violence were from middle school and high school. And so they put this task force together to be proactive. And what ends up happening is that usually these task forces are assigned to impoverished areas. Usually impoverished areas have the higher incidence of crime. And so you
Predominantly black folk or people of color.
Typically, that's what you run into. And being an African American officer in a system that, was, most people would say, was born out of slave catching, it's like, how can you be a sellout or a traitor? And you're dealing with all these different stigmas and whatnot as it relates to your race and what side of the fence you're on as a police officer.
Like who you with, as Bernie Mac said, who you with?
Yeah, no doubt, one of them things, right? And so, with that violence task force, it puts you in a lot of high-risk situations where you're pulling out, doing a lot of felony traffic stops, people with guns, drugs, known offenders, and...
Hey, motherfuckers, whenever I'm in Charlotte, I'm getting jiggy with the chocolate box.
Yes.
Get jiggy with it. Special on earth. Yes.